what are the three pillars of observability. I'm adding James into the screen and he would get started. Over to you, James. Thank you.
So yeah, as Ashish said, I wanted to kind of extend what Ashish has been talking about around monitoring. So monitoring is obviously mechanisms that you can put in place to be able to look at what's happening in your system. Whereas the difference with observability is if there's a problem, or if you want to go in and debug your system or look at a problem within your system, that's where observability comes in. So the two are very, very linked. They're very similar, but one is more about actively monitoring and seeing what's going on, and observability is more about debugging. And when it comes to observability, there's three key pillars that I normally like to talk to people about. And they are metrics, which Ash has already covered in quite a lot of detail today. There's logs, which are written pieces of information that may come out of your application. And then there's traces, and I'll come on to traces in a little more detail when I get to that. And these are the three things that you likely need to get a good observability strategy for your application. So to start with metrics very quickly, because Ashish already covered this in quite a lot of detail, but you've got infrastructure metrics that you can get out of AWS. So things like CPU utilization, your disk space, your network traffic, the number of connections to your databases maybe. And these are all really useful metrics to do things like auto scaling. So if your servers are under a lot of load, you can add additional EC2 instances. The same for databases or for maybe queues. You can scale up your infrastructure or your application based on these metrics. So they're really useful. But there's another type of metric that I think are also equally useful. And these are metrics that are specific to your application. And I'll tell you why. If you released a new version of your application to one of your EC2 instances, for example, and that introduced a problem into your application. Now, if there was a problem in your application, things like your CPU utilization, your disk space, your network traffic might be really low. So that may not necessarily trigger any infrastructure metrics or any infrastructure alarms. But if all of a sudden let's say it's an e-commerce application, you stop getting orders received and orders stop getting placed, well, you could then use that to notify you that there is a problem, something's happened, something's changed, your average usage. If you think of the Netflix graph that Ashish just showed, if all of a sudden at 7 p.m. there was no traffic, that would then indicate that there may be a problem. So having metrics that are specific to your application are also really useful. And things like feature usage are also incredibly useful. So if you build a new feature for an application, you want to understand if customers are actually using that feature. And then when you know which features are being used and which ones aren't, you can then choose where to focus your development effort to provide the most value to your customers. So that's the important thing with metrics. You've got infrastructure metrics, which are incredibly useful, but it's also worth thinking about what metrics are important to your business, to your application, and how can they be used to help monitor your system. So moving on to logs now. So logs are written pieces of information that may come out of your application that you can use to help identify errors or troubleshoot errors. And at least when I first started working in software, I used to write log messages that looked something like this. So I'd be building something on my laptop, I'd be writing messages, I'd be reading the message and say, yes, everything works great. This is all looking fantastic. But once you then run that in production, and let's say this is, again, an e-commerce application, and now let's say there's requests, I make a request, but also Jamila's trying to do something at the same time. Now, looking at these log messages now, there's no way I can identify which log messages are for which person. It's all just kind of merged into one, like which database storage is mine, which is for Jamila's request. So if I was coming in to try and look at this now and work out what was happening, let's say there was a problem with Jamila's order, I wouldn't know which messages to look at. And I made this mistake for many years of just writing messages out and then coming to debug it and it being really challenging. So when it comes to logs, one thing we would always recommend people do is use some kind of structured format to your logs. So instead of just writing out a message, write it out in a format that is standardized and the same across all of your log messages. And the benefit of this now is that you can now identify which messages are for my request and which messages are for Jamila's request. And I'll go into more detail on this when I actually go into the AWS console in just a moment. But this now makes it really easy, if there was an issue, for me to come back and look at exactly what happened with either my order or Jamila's order. And that leads quite nicely onto traces. So traces are about passing a common identifier between the different parts of your application to be able to do things like that and group your logs together to identify which logs are for the same request. Now, traces do become more important when you start to build larger, more distributed systems. And we're going to talk about microservices and serverless next week. But how a trace will work, that if a request comes into a service in your application, that first service will generate some kind of identifier. But that service may return back to the person who made the request, but there may be other things that happen behind the scenes. So if you imagine when you place an order on Amazon.com, you place the order on the website, you get an order confirmed, that's great. But then there's other things that then happen behind the scenes that you don't see. So like the order getting shipped, your payment getting processed. These are all other things that happen behind the scenes after you've actually confirmed your order and you've gone away. So if you were trying to work out what had happened in Amazon.com, you'd need this common identifier. So the trace may get generated at first, and then that trace may be passed back to the user or the web browser that made the request. But then that same trace identifier would then be passed between all of the other parts of the application. That means that when you come to look at your logs, you can then look at your logs across all of your services, and there's a common identifier across all of them. So again, if you imagine with the Amazon example, let's say there's a problem with the payment, you could then relate the payment to the shipping to the actual original order that came in when you actually look at your log messages. So they're the three parts of observability: logs, metrics, and traces. Now, what I'm going to do now, hopefully, is just go into the AWS console and show you how you can look at both logs, metrics, and traces in the console. So CloudWatch, as she's talked about earlier, is the kind of the core service for any kind of logging or alerting or metrics. And I'm going to start with metrics. So if I go into the metrics section in CloudWatch, and you can see I've got two different sections here. So I've got AWS metrics, and this is where you see your like CPU utilization, your actual infrastructure metrics. So I can go into my API, for example, and have a look at, not in there. I can look at the latency for my API, for example, and I can see that this will be a good metric to look at how quickly my application is responding to my users. So I can look at the latency, I can look at the number of errors. So I can see there's been a number of errors in my application. I can look at the total of how many requests
James,
there are. Yep.
Can you zoom in a little bit so that it would be a little visible? Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, this is better. Much better. Thank you.
So I can look at the total number of requests that I received. So they're really useful infrastructure metrics. But I've also got some custom metrics as well. So if I just remove them metrics for a second and I look at my custom metrics, so I've actually started storing some simple metrics on the total number of orders I received. And this is just some fake. This isn't an actual order site. I'm not getting 12,000 orders in my e-commerce application. This is just some fake data I've loaded in. But I can start to see the total number of successful orders that was placed. And you can see here, I had a massive drop off all of a sudden in the number of orders that were being placed in my application. And that may be the sign of some kind of problem. But the same way, I can also look at failures. So I did have a couple of order failures throughout my system here. And this is where you get the value of both infrastructure metrics and application metrics. So if I now go on to logs now, so logs in CloudWatch are stored in groups, and you can define these log groups. And if I just go in to look at one of these log groups now, you see that I just get some a bunch of different information. If I look at a couple of these now, so you see this one here, this one's a bit more help, this one's a bit more complicated. So I've just got a lot of data. There's nothing easy to look at here. I can expand it, and you can see when I was talking about the structured log format, that's what I've built here. I've got this kind of structured format that gives me a common structure across all of my logs. And what I can then do, where I've got this trace identifier, I can actually use that to query my logs. So I can query across all of my logs. If I go into log insights and I save the query, I can then run a query for that identifier. That will then help me see all the logs for that identifier. Now, if all these logs were stored across multiple different applications, in one view now, I could run a query to see all of the logs for my application across all of the different services, because I have got this common trace identifier. So it's really useful to structure your logs in that way, because it turns them almost into a database, and you can treat your logs as a database with a schema, and you can actually query them. And then finally, I just wanted to really quickly touch on traces. So there's a lot of in-depth detail we could get to with traces, so I just wanted to cover it very quickly. But the service in AWS for tracing is called X-Ray. And if I go and look at traces now, and what traces will show me, and if I search for that same identifier that I just looked at the logs for, traces will actually give me some information about what exactly happened. So you can see that a client request came in, it talked to Lambda, and then I talked to a DynamoDB table, and I can see the different metrics for each different part of that and how long it took. So I can see the total request took 2.3 seconds, and I can actually look at the time it took for each individual part. So DynamoDB took 1.93 seconds to respond. The actual code ran for 2.3 seconds overall. So you can get some really good detail on exactly what is going on in your application when you need to debug. And if I come right down to the bottom here, you can also see the actual logs that also relate to that same trace identifier. So I can see all the logs and all my traces in one place. Now, where this gets really useful, to give you an example of where this will be really helpful, if you imagine you were building an application and there was a website on it and a user tried to do something and there was an error. So you might show a pop-up on the screen to the user that says there's been a problem. Now, if you have traces enabled and login enabled, you could, in that message that you pop up to the user, say, please contact support and give them this reference number. And so then when your users are actually raising issues with your system, they could raise them with a specific identifier. And then somebody who is supporting your application can just come into an interface like this and start to look at very specifically the exact data for that exact request that the user had a problem with. So yeah, that's what traces gives you. It gives you that really that detailed look at how a request moves through your system. One of the other really cool features that you get with traces is this service map feature, which is quite cool, in that it will give you a map of all the different services that your application calls. And I can see that about 20% of my application code is failing, and the other 75% is completing successfully. I can see that I'm talking to DynamoDB and also EventBridge up there. So that's logs, metrics, and traces. The three, as I said, are really important. They work really well together. Metrics is about monitoring and prediction and understanding what is happening, and logging and tracing is about going into your system and actually be able to debug and work out what has gone wrong in your application. I hope that was useful. Any questions at all, as always, please feel free to message me on LinkedIn or in the chat once I'm back in the chat window. And yeah, thank you.